What sorts of things drive you? You both are working so hard. You're activists. You never stop reading and writing. You're passionately engaged in the world, and I wonder what's driving you both. What's motivating you? What's important to you? To make you...
What's important?
What's important?
Looking in the mirror in the morning and not being appalled at what I see, you know?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's looking out the window and not being appalled at what I see.
So in other words, you're really concerned about feeling that in your life you've done all you can do to improve
I know I haven't done anywhere near what I could do, which is why I often am appalled when I look in the mirror. But looking out the window and seeing what's there. And
you feel the responsibility as an intellectual.
Not as an intellectual, just a human being.
As a human being.
I mean, I think it's a kind of funny question. The question that ought to be, like a lot of questions, it's the wrong one.
Yeah.
The question that ought to be asked is, why doesn't everybody engage themselves, recognize that they're not engaging themselves enough, because none of us are, even saints, in trying to help deal with the problems of suffering people.
Also, what is there in our society that makes empathy in such short supply? I'm more shocked by that in other people in every society, the inability to picture what it is like to be somebody else. Now, my profession as a novelist, I have to do that. I become other people. But I've always had that tendency, and I'm always startled when I start to talk to people who start going on about how much they hate the blacks or the Jews or the gay people, and you suddenly see there is no ability to identify with anyone else except themselves. And I suppose if I had a motivating thing, it probably would come out in an overwrought empathy and irritability at its absence in others.
Welcome to In Conversation. I'm Jay Perini. The idea for this program is simple: to bring together people of real distinction in a context where conversation can occur. The notion for such a program came to me several years ago when I was invited for dinner by my friend and Vermont neighbor, Robert Penn Warren. Warren's other guest that evening was Saul Bellow, the novelist who had just won his Nobel Prize for Literature. And I remember sitting on the Warren screened-in porch in the shadow of Mount Stratton and thinking that I was really privileged to be there that night, listening in on some of the best conversation that I can imagine ever taking place. Today in Cambridge, we're bringing together two of America's leading intellectuals, Gore Vidal and Noam Chomsky, in conversation.
I feel this is a bit the first supper.
Gore Vidal and Noam Chomsky are both in their ways purists. Some would even call them extremists. Vidal, of course, is a major writer, the author of 25 novels, including such famous bestsellers as Lincoln, Burr, and Myra Breckinridge. He ran for Congress in Upper New York State for the Democrats in 1960, and very nearly won. In 1982, he ran for the Senate in California. He has also written nearly 40 movies, including Ben-Hur and Suddenly Last Summer. Vidal is also well known because of his many appearances over the years on such popular TV talk shows as Larry King and Johnny Carson. Perhaps his most memorable TV appearances were in 1968, when he debated William F. Buckley in a series of encounters staged by ABC during the presidential campaigns of that infamous year. The last debate in Chicago ended up in near fisticuffs. Noam Chomsky is a man of many lives. His groundbreaking work in the field of theoretical linguistics, which is the study of language, has been compared to that of Freud in psychology and Marx in economics. He is, by any reckoning, an intellectual of world-class stature, a philosopher of language, a scientist of the mind. He has received innumerable prizes for his work in linguistics, including, most recently, the prestigious Kyoto Prize for Science. But Chomsky has also been a leading political activist, an American dissident. Chomsky is also a man on the move. Professor at MIT, he often lectures 3 times a week in places other than Cambridge, Massachusetts, usually about politics. Almost incredibly, he has written over 24 books on the subject of American foreign policy, and his books, each of them a landmark in its way, range in subject from the Vietnam War to Central America to the Middle East. He has also written brilliantly about the role of intellectuals in American life. Now, in conversation, Gore Vidal and Noam Chomsky.
I'll give you a little picture. I like to do little pictures. 2 years ago, Rights of Man in Paris, 200th anniversary, and I'm there to talk about it on television. And all the chiefs of state from all the world are there, and the whole center of Paris is cordoned off. The day after, I'm trying to get out of the hotel. Suddenly down the empty streets comes this black limousine with 2 American flags, and the presidential seal is George Bush and Barbara and the Secret Service. And they go slowly down the street, and I have to walk a couple blocks still trying to find a way to get out of there. It comes back up the street. They're lost. All their fucking time. And no one had paid any attention to the Emperor of the West in Paris at this meeting. And I said to myself, this is an odd thing to see the Emperor of the West drifting around the streets of Paris. He's going to have to think of something to do. And he did.
He decided to invade a little country.
A war is the usual diversion. His son was possibly, allegedly going to prison for his S&L efforts. Mm-hmm. The cost of bailing out the S&Ls, according to that radical paper, the Wall Street Journal, it will be slightly more than the entire cost of World War II to the United States in today's dollars. So there's a lot to divert attention from, and that, to me, was the point of the war. There obviously subtext, but that's the central one in my mind.
I agree with you on the diversion. I mean, there are many audiences that had to be addressed by this operation. One of them is the American population, who have to be diverted not just from the S&Ls, but from the whole growing social and economic catastrophe around them, which has been very much accelerated in the Reagan-Bush years. And in fact, after all, this is not the first time. There have been periodic episodes of exactly this sort right through the 1980s. There's been repeated huge propaganda efforts establishing some awesome chimera about to destroy us, and then we're miraculously rescued at the last minute. International terrorists, and then you bomb Libya and we're saved. Narco traffickers, and you smash up Panama and we're saved. Even Grenada, 100,000 people, was set up as a major threat to our existence with an airfield, and going to interdict sea traffic in the Caribbean and so on, and then we're saved and so on. And that's standard. I mean, you have to divert. You want to make sure that the population doesn't think about what's around them and maybe do something about it. Obviously, that's one audience, but the international scene is, well, that's one part of it, but there's more. I think the imperial element is also significant. The third world has to be taught a lesson. They have to be taught a lesson that if you step on our toes, you don't just get beaten, you get pulverized. And in fact, the administration was kind enough to give us that story in their own words. They leaked, just as the so-called ground war was not a war, the ground operation was beginning, they leaked a section of a national security review, policy security review from Security Policy Review from the early days of the Bush administration, so long before this, and it was a section on third world threats. And what it said was something like this. It said, in the case of a much weaker enemy, it is not enough to defeat them. You have to defeat them decisively and rapidly, because anything else would be too embarrassing and might undercut political support. So the trick is you find a much weaker enemy, build them up to be a major, monstrous force, menacing force.
Saddam Hussein's army.
Defeat them, or, Norega, which was done just a year ago with Norega. Defeat them decisively and rapidly, and that's the only way you can keep political support. And that's a lesson to the third world, but it's also a lesson to the world as a whole. I mean, the United States no longer is the overwhelmingly dominant economic force in the world as it was for many years. It's now just one of three. But in military force, it ranks supreme, and it has every reason to want confrontations in the world shifted to the military arena, because the domain of force is where the United States is dominant, and you play your strong card in any confrontation. U.S. card happens to be force. Furthermore, it's more intricate because the U.S. no longer has the economic base to carry out the traditional role of third world intervention. It therefore has to become, as the business press has been very frank in pointing out, has to become a mercenary state. Others are going to have to pay for these adventures, and one source of payment is petrodollars. One of the major sources of capital in the world is the profits from energy production. And the United States wants to make sure, as it has long wanted to make sure, that those profits are fed primarily to support the U.S. economy and, of course, the economy of its lieutenant in these operations, namely Britain. That goes way back.
What about the standard argument here, though, Noam, that Saddam Hussein really is a bad guy?
Yeah, sure he is.
That he did do a terrible thing in invading his neighboring country, Kuwait. That he did subject the Kuwaiti people to terrible tortures. And that he also was probably building up a nuclear arsenal. So these were all, so in many ways there was a justification for this war.
Well, look, all of those things are true, and they were all true on August 1st. On August 1st, when it was true in 1980. In 1980, Saddam Hussein was basically a Russian client. Reagan and Bush and Thatcher recognized him as our kind of guy, you know, and they worked very hard for several years to switch him over to the U.S. side. In 1982, he was taken off the list of terrorist states so that they could then get huge U.S. credits to buy U.S. exports. Became one of the leading U.S. became one of his leading trading partners. By 1987. Iraq was largely a Western, dependent on the West, also for the buildup of its extensive weapons of mass destruction and so on. When he did things like, say, gassing the Kurds in 1988, the Reagan administration intervened to prevent Congress from condemning it in any serious way, let alone to stop sanctions. This went right on to 1990. I mean, in July 1990, Bush intervened again to try to prevent the House Foreign Affairs Committee from condemning Saddam Hussein, or it did impose some sanctions that would interfere with American business. In fact, on August 1st, you know, while they were getting not only warnings, but direct statements from the CIA saying the invasion is coming, on August 1st, the White House authorized new high-technology shipments to Iraq. In the preceding 2 weeks, up to August 1st, they had authorized, according to what's been made public so far, who knows the real story, but what's been made public so far, they authorized almost $5 million worth of high-technology aid.
To go to Iraq.
It went not just to Iraq, it went to the Ministry of Military Industry, it went to the nuclear research plant that was later bombed on the grounds that it was producing military bombs, and to a chemical, to another plant that was bombed on the grounds that it was producing chemical and biological weapons. Now that was 2 weeks before. And it's true that the invasion of Kuwait was a crime, but you know his record was so sordid that what it added to it is very slight and was of no concern to the United States.
But so this makes no sense. What's the turning point? Why?
The turning point is he stepped on our toes. Well, that you don't do. I mean, by the standards of the United States and Britain, you can gas your population, you can torture, you can murder, you can set up one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world. That's all fine as long as you're our thug. Yes. But he did something on August 2nd, which is impermissible. He was told, we don't care very much if you rectify border problems, but he took over Kuwait, and that's not allowed. We run the oil business, and when anybody steps on our toes, especially if they're much weaker, then they get not only defeated, but pulverized. That's the lesson that has to be learned. Don't step on our toes.
You speak of the lesson to the second and third world countries. Even more important, apropos of my vision of an aimless president drifting lost in Paris, ignored by other leaders, this was a message, a lesson to the first world, that not only were the Soviet Union off the world stage as an empire, what we are doing, we have no national at all reason in the Middle East. We have no national interest. We get 15% of our oil comes from there, and we could just as easily get it from somewhere else. But of course, Western Europe and Japan get most of their oil from there. I think, I don't believe that American administrations are very good at planning or indeed thinking, and they're generally rather ignorant. But I suspect that this is not only a message to Western Europe, but to Japan, that we are going to be a permanent military presence in the Middle East, and that's where the oil supply is. And I can see further down the road, we would absolutely collapse economically if every quarter the Japanese didn't come in and buy American Treasury bonds. I could just see the Bank of Japan dragging its feet, or the Bundesbank, and the United States clearing its throat and starting to talk about oil prices. and suddenly they will start buying our treasury bonds. I mean, it's blackmail.
Well, I think that's, I don't entirely agree with that. I think there's another factor. It's true that we don't use oil from the very little oil from the Middle East, and as you say, we could get by with none. On the other hand, the profits from Middle East oil are a major factor.
Oh, the oil companies, yes.
Not just the oil companies. It's not just the oil companies. The profits made by the client states. The way when Britain and the United States set up the imperial settlement for the region, the oil is the idea is, goes back to Lord Curzon, that you set up what Lord Curzon called an Arab facade, and that then Britain, but later the United States, would rule, would disguise absorption behind the veil of constitutional fictions like buffer state and so on. So you have this Arab facade, which is basically family dictatorships. They manage the oil system for us, but we make sure that we do have there's some leverage over pricing and production. We want that to be in our hands for exactly the reasons you mentioned. We also want to make sure that the flow of investments, of capital, of profits, is largely back to the British and American economies. Actually, we have documentary evidence on this. The documentary record's been cleared partially, at least, through about 1960. And it's very interesting to look at the declassified British and American records after the Iraqi Revolution in 1958. That was the first break in the Anglo-American condominium. So naturally they were hysterical about it. And Selwyn Lloyd flew over to Washington and talked to Dulles and so on and so forth. And they decided at that time to grant some kind of nominal independence to Kuwait to try to dampen the threat of another nationalist revolution there. And though they reserved the right, as Selwyn Lloyd put it, ruthlessly to intervene if anything goes wrong with this settlement. And the reasoning was that, at that time, particularly Britain, they were very concerned about, that Kuwaiti investments had to, both Kuwaiti oil and Kuwaiti investments had to prop up this tottering British economy, and in fact prop up sterling altogether. Now, by the 1970s, the U.S. is in the same position. And it's not just the Japanese who buy treasury bonds. The Saudi Arabians buy them.
Do you realize what the average American listener to this program will think, hearing you people talk about the war in the Gulf? You're essentially saying that that what was seen on television was a mirage, that essentially the main arguments for the Gulf War were faked. Really what we're looking at are underlying economic, profit-oriented reasons for pursuing this war in the Gulf.
Profit and power.
Profit and power.
And I would stress again what Gore said, diversion of the American public. I mean, the American public must look away from their own problems, exactly.
But this isn't the picture that most Americans have.
Why should it be?
What's
the media are doing their job, after all, and the intellectuals are doing their job, which is to prevent people from understanding what's happening.
I mean, I've just been speaking at Harvard, a pleasant and gentle place, but Harvard exists, as does CBS, ABC, New York Times, to give the viewpoint of the establishment that owns and runs the country. And they have a worldview which does not coincide at any point with any reality that anybody mildly curious can discover. I would say that probably what the people think on almost any subject has been doctored for. Sanctions were working against Saddam. The problem was that 90% of the people, when asked do they think sanctions were working, didn't know what the word meant. A few Roman Catholics thought that a sanction was a step towards sainthood, somewhere after beatitude and before. The rest of them had no idea at all.
What about the debate in the U.S. Senate about should we authorize the war or not? One saw a real medley of voices, points of view there, didn't we?
Well, you certainly saw some quite good speechwriters had been called in, I must say. There was eloquence, and many people who could not parse a sentence were giving rather nice speeches. No, what you saw was the total collapse of our constitutional system of government, in which only Congress may declare war. Bush at one point said what I've been saying for years. Why, he said we've done armed intervention 220 times, and only 5 times have we ever declared war. I've been saying this, and they've been denying it. Now,
why shouldn't we be praising George Bush now? Because he actually decided to follow a legal route to pursuing this war.
That's not the
And he also brought into the coalition so many other nations. He didn't act unilaterally.
Neither of those statements is accurate.
No, it was.
The coalition was the United States and England. In fact, up until January.
What about France?
Up until January 15th, it was a U.S.-British command in the Gulf. After it became clear the war was going to go on, France, Italy, and a couple of other countries decided they'd like to get their fingers in the post-war settlements and the contracts.
3 days
and so on,
before
so
we
they went
started.
along, you know.
3 days
But it
before
was a
we-
U.S.-British command, and it was a U.S.-British war, very isolated in the world. It's true, the famous 28 countries that were in the coalition, most of them were there to enforce the sanctions. In fact, and as far as the legalities are concerned, the U.S. just once again did what it's been doing for many years, namely undermine the United Nations. The United Nations has procedures, and they were blocked.
But didn't we get a UN resolution?
No, well, we notice what the resolution said. We got a resolution in which the UN said, in effect, we wash our hands of the matter.
Why would they do that? Why would so many countries just fall back and take a back seat? They're not
United
countries.
States is a very frightening place. You don't fool around with it. This is what's been happening in the UN for years. Let's just take the period during which George Bush has been in national prominence. He was appointed UN ambassador in February '71, so say take that period. During that time, the United States has vetoed about 2/3 of the Security Council resolutions that have been vetoed by the United States. About half of the rest have been vetoed by England, United Kingdom. That's between them. That's about 80%. Way down in third place is France, and fourth is the Soviet Union. The United Nations, the same as in the General Assembly. I mean, you get votes in the General Assembly like 150 to 1 or 148
We've also
to
placed
2 and so on.
ourselves outside the law. We made it very clear over Nicaragua when we were called before the International Court at The Hague, which we'd helped set up at the beginning of the century, over mining the Nicaraguan harbors, and we said, we don't recognize the court at The Hague.
No, we're rejecting, right now we're rejecting reparations.
I mean, this is
the one
piracy.
country that's rejecting reparations, meanwhile calling on Iraq to pay reparations. But in this current case, if you look closely at what happened at the UN, I think it was another case in which the United States and its English lieutenant succeeded in subverting the United Nations. I mean, the UN response was pursue sanctions and diplomacy. As usual effort after any act of aggression. It usually is blocked right away by the United States, which vetoes it or undermines it. But look what happened. The United States intervened directly to block diplomacy. I think sanctions probably already had worked. I mean,
But you know, we didn't have to go for, in the past, the American presidents wouldn't have gone for UN support in any case.
Yeah, but look, this was a
Isn't this a turning point
No.
for the American empire?
No, it's a big operation. I mean, this is not like invading Panama, where we don't ask anybody what they think. We just invade Panama. This is 500,000 troops in the most sensitive area of the world, which everybody's concerned about. You have to get at least the pretense of a cover of support. And in fact, after a lot of arm twisting and pressures and threats, they succeeded in getting the Security Council to abdicate. That's in effect what happened.
It's the old frog in the pan thing. If you put a frog in a pan with water, cold water, it'll sit there. You can heat it up until it becomes boiling, and the frog will feel nothing. As it is happening so gradually, the frog adapts to each change of the water. At the end of it, there's a dead frog. But he has not had any anxiety about it. Well,
So
I sometimes think our people are the frog in the pan, that things are going very badly for the economy, for the average person. And no one's doing anything about it. And we have the politics of diversion, which are foreign adventures, and we have a irresponsible, to put it mildly, press.
Has the empire really run out of gas? I mean, are we at the end of empire now, or are we just in a middle phase? Do we have another 50 years of diversionary tactics abroad?
Oh, the empire ended in 1950 when we were defeated in Korea. That was really the end, and the Russians got the atomic weapons. There was then parity. Once there's parity, you're not the world empire. You may be a world empire.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, I think it's impossible to answer it one way or another. There's fluctuations in the world system. I mean, it's true that the peak of U.S. power was in the late 1940s. I mean, then it was just, I mean, there had been nothing like it in human history, the extent
What
of
did we
US
control? About 80% of the world's wealth?
50%.
50% of the world's
It was about
wealth.
50% of the world's wealth, but also we
And
had
all the military
and all the military force, and
So we had all the guns.
and total security and the capacity to I mean, the intention was to organize and structure the entire world.
And the
That's what
English
the
Empire.
Marshall Plan was about.
And there was a whole global planning system went back to that was an unusual peak of power. I mean, it was obvious that couldn't remain. For one thing, other industrial areas would recover ultimately, and power would become diffused. And as you say, the Russians got atomic weapons. Well, now the world system's changed again. I mean, from the it's not just now. I mean, since 1970, it's been clear that the world system is changing significantly. Power in the U.S. domains, power has very much diffused. The so-called trilateralism of the 70s was a reflection of the fact that there were three major economic centers, and their relations are shifting. The U.S. is relatively declining. It's still the most powerful, but it's declining, and the Bush-Reagan years have accelerated that decline.
Well, we're very rich, but we've borrowed too much money. Are you saying that we can't really sustain the guns of empire?
Well,
we can't really
it's
afford such.
It's understood that we can't, which is why you will read in everything from the Financial Times to the Chicago Tribune that we have to become a mercenary state. Others are going to have to. In fact, they say it like when
the Gulf War was a mercenary war.
Well, I mean, it's not only that, but they're hoping to make a big profit on it, if you can believe the numbers they're giving.
It's extortion racket, really.
Yeah, in fact, the financial editor of the Chicago Tribune put it rather nicely. What he said is, we have to sell protection to the world.
Yeah.
We have to run a protection racket.
It's
We're going to be the global mafia. I mean, if some country wants a third world, if somebody's bothering you, say some third world country is pushing you or trying to get something from you, you call on us, we'll break their bones for them, and you'll pay it. That's the image. Now, how long can a system like that be sustained? Well, that's unpredictable.
I'd like to ask you each what you really find the most difficult about this country. If you had to isolate something that was the most painful thing about it living here for you, being in America, what would it be?
Well, I'm most disturbed by the collapse of the educational system. That whenever you start to describe anything, it's what I call inventing the wheel. You can't count on anybody having enough information on any subject unless it's his own work, in which case he's apt to be quite good and he can tell you. But we don't have very much information in common with one another, which a common public educational system once gave us.
Would you return to the great book system then? Do you think we should go back to teaching the classics?
Oh,
reading, writing, and arithmetic?
I have a whole theory on education. I'd make history the spine of it. I'd start in the 12 years of state indoctrination, which is what the public school system is. I'd start in the first year with a big bang, Garden of Eden, give them everything. This is for the first graders. I would then teach the history of the human race, east and west, north and south, for 12 years. Then I would bring in the sciences, the arts, as they crop up in the story of our race, so that by the time somebody graduated, he would know where China was. He would know who Confucius was. He would have a sense of where the human race has been. Now, the two things, which I'm so amazed by in education, the two things that everybody's got to live with all his life, one is his body, the other is his money. Most adults don't know where their liver is until it is too late. Most don't know where their money is until Mr. Keating goes to jail.
Right.
The schools wouldn't dream of teaching you anything that you needed to know.
So you'd have them teach things.
I would have them teach the history of our race. And at the end of it, you would leave school and you'd be 17 years old and you'd know where we've been. Then you might want to go someplace else, but you would have an idea of the whole thing. So if you say what disturbs me the most is I don't have many people to talk to. Because I keep finding there's subjects I don't even bring up because you'll get a blank.
So conversation has become impossible in any real sense.
No, you talk about...
There are not enough points of
common reference. You talk about Madonna. I'm happy to do that for a while, but one Madonna does not an Athens make.
How about you, Noam? What you find most anguishing about this place?
Well, I should say just on this topic...
We can, sure. Do you agree with
I
that?
sort of agree, but on the other hand, I do find conversation much easier than 30 years ago. there are very substantial, I mean, these trips that you mentioned around the country, talking to people. I mean, I can enter into the kinds of discussions and give the kinds of talks today that I couldn't have dreamt of 30 years ago.
Really?
Yes, absolutely, because the level of understanding and awareness.
How could that be then? This is directly in contradiction with
No,
what
it's
you're
not.
saying.
It's not.
No,
Because
we're
things are happening in many dimensions. I mean, the educational system is becoming narrower, impoverished, and collapsing. The media are, first of all, actually the media are freer than they were 30 years ago, but they're still pretty bad. The intellectual classes are doctrinaire, rigid, committed to a kind of cultural totalitarianism, if you like. On the other hand, many other things happen in the world. People, society is a complicated place. So things like, say, the civil rights movement, or things like the solidarity groups, or things that have happened in the church, for example, or all sorts of things have created a big ferment, among
When
the
people
general
talk
population.
to you, presumably they're talking from a base of knowledge and common
Yeah,
points
but
of
there are
reference.
lots of ways to get knowledge.
Yeah.
See, one way, I mean, if you go down to, say, Arizona, or Iowa, where there's, you take a look at take, say, the Central American movements, which were big things in the 80s, very important. I mean, the people who got their information about Central America did not get it from the media. They didn't get it from the educational system. They got it in other ways. They got it by, some of them by direct contact.
So you're saying, yes, Gore's right, that the educational system,
Yeah,
that
there are
the
other
public
things
education
happening.
system is
There are
not
other
good.
things happening.
But there's other things
Well,
happening.
if you go out searching and you go out speaking the Eleanor Roosevelt line, or what you do, quite a good deal of, and what I do, at least in a couple of elections, of course you find like-minded people. I had the whole oil thing explained to me by somebody in Eureka when I was running for Senate. Guy in the fuel business. He understood the entire Middle Eastern thing far better than the Wall Street Journal, which I'd been relying on.
I don't understand the contradiction here then. If the country's got no educational system, it's all falling apart, how is it that we've got so many people who are up on things?
bright
and
people
situations
are
like
bound to
that?
Because there are other ways to learn things. See, I mean, when you ask what bothers me most about the country, it's not the educational system. It's tortured bodies in El Salvador and homeless people in the streets of New York and things like that.
People
but just
in pain,
keeping to, yeah, I mean, we're causing lots of people to suffer badly, and we don't have to. Because
Suffer
we have
real pain, hunger,
torture, mutilation, slaughter, and we could go on and on. And
Right.
or just the rotting away in inner cities in what amount to concentration camps.
And you are blaming us for that somewhat.
Well,
you're blaming us for
Well, I mean, I think we
in
have
Central America.
well, I don't know who us is, but
Right.
I think we have we collectively
Right.
have the resources and the capacity to mitigate a lot of this suffering. For one thing, we're responsible for a lot of it, so we can obviously mitigate it. But we could also change our own lives and institutions and interactions so as to improve it. We could do that.
Well, the actual defense budget is 2/3 of the revenues of the federal government. They always say, well, it's only 1/3 because they include Social Security payments. Well, they are a part. And so are the disbursements. So they always say, boy, they're just 1/3 for the Pentagon. And these people programs, and to see those heads shake sadly over the welfare mothers living at the Ambassador East Hotel, drinking champagne, they just shake their heads over that. Take out Social Security as revenue and take it out as disbursements, and you'll see that 2/3 of the revenues of the country have gone for war ever since Harry Truman created the national security state, which replaced the American Republic. And I don't happen to I like the old republic. I'm a reactionary, which I think makes me absolutely politically
When you say you
okay in America.
what does that really mean? I know you've called for a new constitutional convention.
Well, that would be the civilized response, but that will not be allowed. That's what Thomas Jefferson expected.
When you say you like the old republic, what do you mean?
Well, the old republic, Jefferson said there should be a constitutional convention at least once a generation, about every 30 years. He said you cannot expect a man to wear a boy's jacket. And instead of all these amendments and so on, that you would eventually try and systematize the thing and change it, adjust it. We haven't done that. And the result is that in 1949, National Security Council Act number 68 was the one that set up a national security state. They united the War Department, the Navy Department, the Defense Department, OSS becomes CIA.
When you say they, Gore, I'd like to know who you mean by they.
We begin with Harry Truman. We begin with $1 a year businessmen who had come to Washington, Engine Charlie Wilson and Electric Charlie Wilson, and other like-minded people of both political parties. Vandenberg was working on the Republican side, and Harry Truman and Dean Acheson were working on the Democratic side.
So you see an oligarchic conspiracy, really.
Well,
a conspiracy of the rich to take over the country and to set up this national security state, as you call it.
Conspiracy is too strong a word. It was a consensus, I would say, and it was, in many ways, it was virtuous. They didn't want to fall back into the Depression, which we had not got out of when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They thought war was good for business. We should stay forever on a wartime footing, which is part of this National Security Council directive. There's, I think, 7 points to it. One of it is interesting. We will never deal with the Soviet Union diplomatically. We will never make any peace or any acknowledgement that they must be permanently outside and permanently the enemy. Well, we lost representative government during this. We've lost much of the Bill of the Rights. It has been eroded. And when people wonder why there are people sleeping out on Melrose Avenue and in Los Angeles, and the schools and the bridges are falling down, well, this is what happened. All the money was taken to sustain the national security state.
And you're saying it wasn't necessarily such a bad thing.
No, they thought they thought they were doing that. They really believed that communism was an evil.
So they
didn't care about Russia. They knew that Russia. This is where they were wicked. They knew Russia was no threat to the United States. We had the atom bomb. They didn't. But they lost 20 million people. They had to use horses to take their heavy weapons out of Central Europe.
But they had the example of Stalinist Russia right before them. This is something to be afraid of. You wouldn't want this kind of totalitarian system in the United States.
There was no chance ever. H.L. Mencken is very funny on it. He said, he wrote this back in the 30s. Mencken said, the Russians and the Americans are very much alike. As peoples, they are slightly less intelligent than the rest of the world. They are deeply religious and rather easily fooled. He said the reason that communism never took hold in the United States, despite poverty and so forth and so on, he said because the Americans instinctively knew what was going on in Russia to folks just like themselves and rejected it. He said, and he said that he used the verb vaccinated, that we had been vaccinated by the likes of Theodore Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan, that we weren't going to fall for that. So I think that no one ever worried about the United States becoming a communist power. Nobody really worried about the Soviet Union as a military threat until by the 60s. Yes, of course it was, but only with provocation.
You know, I was trying to, in reading both of your books this past week again, reading through the various things you've written, I've tried to isolate some differences between you. And one of them seems to be that Gore, being an historian, essentially, a novelist, biographer of America, has a deep interest in the origins of the American constitutional state and essentially a certain kind of faith in the political system. Whereas, Noam, you seem to me to be essentially an anarchist who has very little belief that the system as it's been constituted, even with our founding fathers, has even the slightest prayer of ever working. I was going to ask you the question, what if we played a game here for a minute, and Gore, you were president, and Noam was Secretary of State? I know that's most Americans' worst nightmare. But if that nightmare
mine too.
Actually, I rather like it.
The first thing I would do is resign.
No, I actually, as president, I'd put you in the Defense Department. Now, I see you as my Secretary of Defense. Anyway.
If you were president, you were Secretary of State, if that were a dream possibility, could you change this country? Could you make it more democratic? Could you make it a peace-loving nation that would be kind to its neighbors?
No, because by the time I got elected president or he got elected president, we would have been bought so many times by so many people that we would have to represent the interests that had bought us the position. We would also be very different sorts of people from what we are.
You're a very rich man. You can't be bought by anybody.
Well, there are a lot richer people than me in politics, and they follow the standard line.
Not only that, but first of all, if, on the absurd assumption that somebody like us would be elected, that would be because there had already been mass popular movements developing which were active and participant and so on, and that would have been revitalizing American democracy. It wouldn't be the people on top who would be doing it.
But don't we have that possibility? That can happen in this country. This is a grassroots country.
You can do it in any country. You can do it in any country, but that's not it. But the picture you present is upside down.
Yeah.
You don't do it by first electing somebody who's going to revitalize democracy. If you've gotten to the point where a person representing the public interest could be elected, you have already gone a long way toward revitalizing
And you only
democracy.
get that out of great disaster. I mean, there is no change in any country unless there's a catastrophe, which in our case I suspect will be economic. It'll be hideous inflation, more unemployment. Then you'll see the possibilities of a Huey Long, a figure I quite admire. Or, if you're a pessimist, you'll see a committee from the Pentagon, a committee on public safety, which will take over. So, as Noam is right, you're putting it backwards. You just don't elect somebody who turns out to be a really nice guy and is going to straighten it out. You can't.
So you think
the
it's
word radical
hopeless,
means roots. You know, you have to go to the roots of it, and the president is just a flower, as it were.
In other words, according to both of you, it's hopeless. The way the system is presently constituted, we're inevitably going to drift into further financial disarray,
No, the
more
fact that-
Why do you
totalitarianism.
include that?
The fact
in
that
fact, there are lots of hopeful things around. I think you're looking for them in the wrong place. You're not going to find hopeful things at the level of the President and Secretary of State. You want to find hopeful things, take a look at the church-based solidarity organizations in Kansas. That's hopeful things. There's a lot of grassroots public... So why did the National Security Policy Review that I quoted say that the only kind of intervention now possible is rapid, decisive victory without losing public support?
Because
the country's changed.
Do you think the country has changed?
Oh, absolutely.
Since the Vietnam War?
Very greatly.
Really?
Look, the classic intervention is not even considered an option any longer. You don't have nobody's thinking of Marines slogging around Nicaragua chasing Sandino, or U.S. troops marauding in South Vietnam for years while B-52s smash up the Mekong Delta.
We were pretty happy about 500,000 troops going into the Middle East.
Yeah, but making sure that they don't fight, remember.
But they fought.
They did not.
They didn't.
What did they do?
Look, I mean...
They
It
bombed.
looked like a battle on television.
Well, look,
what were those tanks doing? What were all those
the tanks-
bombers? We killed
look,
200,000 people.
Hold on a second. U.S. casualties were about the level of Grenada, combat casualties. What happened was there was a mass slaughter of a third world peasant army sitting in holes. And after that was done, they allowed troops to walk in and pick up the pieces, making sure that, and what fighting there was done, you know, they made very sure that the people we were killing were killed from a safe distance. Now that's not a war. And they know they can't fight a war, and they don't even pretend otherwise. Now the reason is that
You're saying it's okay to kill people from a distance.
I'm not
with an
saying it's
airplane.
okay. I'm saying that the options
what
for
they were
intervention
doing.
have been narrowed. The options for intervention have been narrowed. The classic forms are, everyone agrees, are over. Nobody even thinks about them. The kinds of intervention you can now carry out are proxy wars, where you use mercenaries like the Contras,
Right.
or
quick surgical
quick
operations.
surgical operations over a much weaker enemy, where you first make sure that you beat them to a pulp, and then you maybe let some soldiers walk in
And you
and
must
pick up
have
the pieces. That's not a war.
total control over the media, because what's going on must not be reported. I watched the war on CNN. Well, the very fact that there was 50,000 sorties, the French word seemed to attract them, so meant that we weren't hitting anything. Those two bridges across the Tigris River are still there. Now, if I were declaring war on Baghdad as my target, I would knock those bridges out. We did not have accurate bombing. At 37,000 feet, you can't hit anything. It was what we called in the Second War carpet bombing, and it was to destroy the civilian population and to make them give up, to devastate them. This cannot be told to the American people. So on the one hand, we now have 45,000 sorties. Well, if you knocked out everything, there are not 45,000 military targets of any importance. It meant we were missing everything.
But you know, we did have the consent of the American people. Something like 80 to 90% of the American people supported this foray in the
You know
Middle East.
what pollsters have a saying? You can get any answer to a poll you want on the way you phrase the question. If Saddam Hussein continues, he lives in a country called Iraq, your gasoline will cost $100 a gallon. should we get rid of him? Yes. So you got 90% against him. I mean, the pollsters have a saying, garbage in, garbage out.
See, actually, some of the polls are very revealing, but I don't think they show what you're concluding.
Yeah.
So, for example, well, I think they show something about an earlier point that you raised, about the role of the media, or really the whole intellectual culture. There were polls right before the bombing. I think it was January 9th or so. The Washington Post published a national poll, which had the following results in it. It said, if Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait could be assured on condition that there would be an international conference on the Arab-Israel problem, would you then agree? Now, that question was framed so as to minimize the possibility of your trick. They actually put the question so as to minimize the probability of a positive response. It started off by saying George Bush is against this, but then that automatically cuts it down because you don't want to be against the president. Then it said, would you agree to this? Well, 2/3 of the population said yes. All right, now let's imagine the following situation. Remember that virtually every person who said yes must have thought, I must be the only person who believes this.
Right.
Because they hadn't seen anyone advocate it. I mean, nobody came out and said, yeah, that's a good idea. So you had people saying, I'm the only one who believes this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Right.
Secondly, virtually no one, maybe no one, who said yes knew that just a week before that, U.S. officials had released an Iraqi proposal to withdraw totally from Kuwait in exactly those terms,
right,
and had regarded it as a serious proposal indicating Iraqi intention to withdraw, and the U.S. had flatly rejected it. Now, virtually nobody knew these things. Suppose that you had an information system which presented the world as it is.
Yes.
Okay, now then you would have people saying, well, yeah, there's an offer like that on the table. It's been debated and discussed, and the merits have been discussed.
Yes.
Now, how many people would have come out in favor of it? Well, probably 98%. And then there wouldn't have been a war. Now, when you ask about public opinion, you can't just say, well, what did they say in the poll? You got to look at these issues. I mean, the matter was set up by months of propaganda and suppression and distortion and so on, which meant that the existence of a diplomatic settlement had been largely suppressed. There had been virtually no discussion of the obviously relevant issues, like the possibility of regional security arrangements and so on.
So it's all propaganda, essentially.
Well, it's propaganda, if you like, yeah.
But all of the kinds of things we're saying will sound to a lot of people like Russia in the 1950s, a situation where essentially thought control is happening. That the government is actively...
It's not the government.
And consciously trying to control people's minds.
Sure, the government, of course, will try to control, but the point is this isn't Russia.
Yes.
The government can't tell CBS or the New York Times or the New York Review of Books, you keep these things quiet.
And there is a range of opinion on these
Is there?
On these networks.
No, there isn't. I mean, the range of opinion is so narrow, it's virtually undetectable.
I was talking on the phone last week to a good friend of mine. I said I was doing an interview with Gore Vidal, Noam Chomsky, and he said to me, those guys complain all the time that they're suppressed, that their voices are never heard. You never turn on the Johnny Carson show that you don't see Gore Vidal. You never open up a paper that there is an article by Noam Chomsky.
Well, first of all,
And Noam Chomsky speaks across the country 3-4 nights a week.
True.
His voice is ubiquitous. Gore Vidal is a household word, and yet you're saying you're suppressed.
I'm not complaining about him. You asked me for a description of what's happening. That's not a complaint. A description is not a complaint. I'm describing the fact. The facts are that in the mainstream media in the United States, there's a very narrow spectrum of opinion that's permitted. I mean, you'll get what amounts to statistical error, or sort of noise in the system, So you get around like 2-3% deviation.
So you won't get the far right or the far left.
Well, I mean, you do get it's not the far left. I mean, like he said he's a reactionary. I'd say I'm a conservative. I mean, I don't think this has anything to do with left or right,
Perhaps those terms in American political life don't mean much.
Yeah, I wouldn't even use them. But the issues that whatever we might think about social and political issues, here we're talking about something which has nothing to do with left and right. We're talking about whether the media should present to the public the fact that there have been a series of diplomatic options open from August which State Department experts regarded as serious and negotiable. What does that have to do with right and left?
So
I mean, that's a question of whether the
you're saying then that the media are suppressing vital information.
It's not just the media, it's also the intellectual community. So you turn to the New York Review of Books, for example. They had a series of articles, in fact, calling for sanctions instead of war. But if you look at them, look at the way they're framed. The way they're framed is, well, we now have these wonderful new prospects for peace. The United Nations can finally function in its peacekeeping role with the Russian veto no longer blocking it and, the third world no longer disrupting. And shouldn't we move forward to take this opportunity to create a wonderful world order based on peace and justice? Well, that's just gross. That's a gross distortion of reality. I mean, the reason the United...
Who wrote that piece,
That
then?
happened to be George Ball.
George Ball? But he's a distinguished...
Everybody is distinguished.
Everybody's distinguished. But the point is that was the first... I didn't quote it exactly, but that's roughly the content of the first paragraph of what was, in fact, a rather good article calling for diplomacy rather than war.
I think at some point we should always make the point that you talked about this isn't Russia, the government doesn't give orders to the press and so on. No, it doesn't. What we have is a ruling class which we're never supposed to say exists, but it does. It's a very powerful one. It's partly money. It's partly bright kids who are trained at places like Harvard to run the place. You don't have to call up the editor of the New York Times or the President of the United States, the head of CBS, and give them the policy on the Middle East. They have these jobs because they think alike. They've been going to the same conditioned schools. They have the same worldview. And where odd types like Chomsky and I come along, and I don't know what motivates him, but I'm much motivated by, I wouldn't even say anything so lofty as a sense of justice as I am by incongruity. Illogic drives me crazy. I can remember in school, the First Amendment was taught, freedom of speech, and then you tried a four-letter word, you couldn't say it in class. I said, all right, now this isn't logical. And I was a real pain, as you can see.
Right.
Anyway, they are shaped, and the United States is very distant from the rest of the world. We're outside civilization. We have our own thing, but we're in a bubble. Why would Chomsky be wandering around the country talking at these little universities on big ones if he didn't feel that it was not only worth doing, but that by explaining the prospect, you can illuminate the prospect and you can help people to make change.
Is that what you're trying to do?
I've never not tried to do it.
And through your political activity?
Of course.
Trying to change things.
Of course. I now call myself a reactionary because it's the only way you can present yourself to the American people. I want to go back to the old republic. Every head starts to nod. If I said I wanted to go forward to something, every head starts to shake. So.
What do you want to change to? I'd like to ask both of you this question. Let's say that we have to change. The situation you've pictured of America is very dismal. You've got a very docile, apathetic population who is fearful. You've got a small group of very rich people who are manipulating the government. You've got a government with a kind of demonic imperial, sounds like a 19th century imperial craze for power, for property, for profit. It's a very dismal picture. You've got a press that's submissive. What would you, what can
First of
happen?
all, it doesn't look as dismal. I don't think I'm seeing it as dismally as you're presenting the way I'm seeing it.
Nor do I.
It seems,
Well, then you're not drawing your own conclusions,
no, that's
Noam.
not
I don't
true.
think you are.
That's not true. I think you're
Your books are very
you're
depressing.
picking out of what I said some strains, but there's another strain, and I've said it here too.
There's a very cynical strain in your writing.
Yeah, but there's also a very optimistic strain. And
Cynical,
the strain,
by
in
the
fact,
way, cynical is the American word for realistic.
Yeah,
We should tell the audience
I
that.
agree. That's the way I interpret it. Yes, I think I try to be realistic. Of course, everyone does. But I think part of realism is to recognize that there's been substantial improvements over the past 30 years. The country is a lot more civilized than it was 30 years ago.
Civilized in what sense? We're still doing the same evil
we're
deeds.
Not, but I keep repeating myself, but we are not. The options of things like, say, the Vietnam War are virtually inconceivable today. Even things like classical intervention are virtually inconceivable today. And the reason is because of changes in the popular mood.
And you both have seen, I think, many glimmers of light in the panorama of the world scene. Gore, be your most hopeful.
Well, the most hopeful thing is that there are two great forces in the world at any given moment. They're very visible now. One is centrifugal and one is centripetal. The Soviet Union is going through a centrifugal phase. Everything's rushing away from the center. Western Europe is centripetal, is coming together in the common market. I think that finally it's getting through to peoples all over the world that the nation state is an unnatural sort of arrangement. Nobody likes it. The sort of Bismarck, Lincoln state. I see that as just instinctively as happening all around the world. We will perhaps break up into cantonal systems, and we have a larger organization for a better environment and a better economy. It's like the common market. So from that point of view, I think something is happening around the world. And if we don't blow ourselves up, I think this centrifugal force is going to be extremely good for it, balanced with the centripetal ones. Now, if it gets out of balance, we're all in trouble.
History is complicated enough and people are complicated enough, so there's a lot of ways of reading the evidence. And a hopeful way of reading the evidence is that over the centuries, and in fact over recent years, there is a constant struggle in which people try to confront and overcome authority and domination and submissiveness and so on. You struggle against it in a lot of ways. I mean, one way to struggle against it is neurosis or pathology, because you don't recognize it and you just internalize it. That's a kind of a non-constructive way to struggle against it. More constructive ways are to recognize it, understand it, find ways of working with others to change it. And there are plenty of indications of that. I mean, we live in a different world than we did 400 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 20 years ago. Insofar as there have been improvements, and there are some, and some significant ones, they're because of the manifestations of these tendencies of, I hope, human nature. Well, that's hopeful.
I want to personally thank you both for coming here, talking with us. It's been a good conversation. Thank you.